This is Dialogue, a weekly conversation where creativity meets technology. This week's episode is brought to you by Lunar Display and iTube Downloader. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is my co-host, Federico Vitici. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you? It's good to do a new show together.
It absolutely is. This is episode 1 of Dialogue, which, did you notice that we spelled it a little different, didn't we? We spelled it like a dialogue box on a Mac because this is a Mac show, not an iOS show. No, that's not what it is. That's not what it is at all.
Don't make me do a Mac show. Me of all people? Come on.
No, I would never do that to you.
Thank you.
That just seems like it would be torture. So, no.
Please, John, you need to describe, because I give you full credit. You had the idea for this show. So let me ask you, what is Dialogue?
Okay, well, if people are familiar at all with the other show that Federico and I do together called App Stories, that show is all about apps, and it has occasional interviews where we'll interview developers and other people in the app community all about apps, but it's from the perspective of apps and hardware and technology and things first, and kind of culture and creativity and those things second. And so what we thought we would do with this show is flip that on its head a little bit. We really enjoy doing those interviews, but the thing is that with App Stories, which we try to keep to a half an hour, is a little too constrained to really get into depth with people. And then when we did last summer, we did a whole series of interviews with a bunch of interesting people for the 10th anniversary of the App Store. And that was a lot of fun, and it really gave me the thought that was bubbling around in my head for the rest of the year about how could we do something more with this and make this a show where Federico and I get to participate a little more because we have a little more time and a little more breathing room, but we also get to introduce all the listeners to a bunch of interesting people. And that's where Dialogue came from. And so Dialogue is going to be a series of interviews with creative people of all sorts, but it's also going to be a seasonal show. And so we're going to have those interviews. First, we're going to have an episode like this one that you're listening to right now, where it's just me and Federico kind of introducing the topic, talking about our own personal perspectives on it. And then we're going to move into a series of interviews with people from all different walks of life and different fields, but it's all going to be related to one topic. And this season, it's all about writers and writing, which we thought would be a good place to start because this is something that me and Federico know a little bit about. And so what you'll be hearing from us going forward, starting with next week's episode, is a series of conversations with writers and songwriters and screenwriters and all sorts of people who have done all sorts of different kinds of writing, and talk to them about how they got into it, what the process is like, and talking about where technology kind of intersects with what they do.
Yeah, I've been describing this, as I mentioned in the trailer for this podcast, I've been describing Dialogue as a spin-off of App Stories, where we took the interview format that we were doing before and expanded it so that we have more headroom in terms of we can have deeper conversations, we can go a little more in depth without the fear of, not going beyond the specific time limit as we usually try to do with App Stories. We've been trying to talk about technology, but in the context of what technology enables, not in the sense of technology itself. So on App Stories, we tend to focus on app development or making video games for iOS and talking about apps and mobile software. Here, we're going to try and have a broader, wider, maybe more mainstream approach and try to talk about technology in the context of what kinds of art forms and what kinds of creative endeavors are made possible and empowered by technology, which I think is a fun and different angle from what we usually do at Mac Stories, the website, and App Stories, the podcast.
Right.
And when John brought up the idea several months ago, I immediately said yes, even though we have busy lives. But when it was the kind of idea that I thought was fresh enough, especially because we're using this seasonal format of Apple Podcasts, which the idea of seasons and each season as a unique topic built around it, and that we're gonna take breaks during the year, we're sort of like the Game of Thrones of podcasting. We're like a TV network here. And I thought that this is fascinating. This is different from what I usually do. So of course I was on board. And we already did a lot of interviews, John and I, on App Stories. So it was the perfect opportunity to expand, do a little more, and have it be a Mac Stories production, of course. So, I think it will be really fun and interesting to follow. It's been interesting to build as a creator, and I hope that for listeners will be different, but also consistent with what we've been doing. It's always fun, John, to talk about technology in a broader context of what it enables for all kinds of people around the world.
Yeah, no, I agree. And for me, that's what I like most about writing about technology and writing about apps is really the stories behind them, the people who make them, the people who use them, what they enable people to create. And we're just taking that kind of idea and expanding it a little bit, which I think is going to be really fun. As I mentioned, it's going to be weekly. So during this first season, we'll have a new episode every week. Some of these interviews that we're doing, we're going to split them up into 2 parts. That way, we're going to keep them under an hour, so we're not taking up too much of anybody's time. We don't want to hit you with like a 2 or 3 hour episode, but we'll go weekly. And when we get to the end of the season, we'll probably do a wrap up episode at the very end, and then we'll just take a little break. We'll plan what the next one's going to be, get some new people involved, and we'll go from there. But it should be a lot of fun, and you'll be hearing from us throughout the summer.
So that's the format. You can subscribe in Apple Podcasts or in Overcast, Castro, any other podcast player that you want to use. We have an RSS feed. We have a website. Everything is linked in the show notes. So you can use whatever you want. We use the seasonal format of Apple Podcasts. So of course, the seasonal breakdown will be best experienced in the Apple Podcasts app for now, but ideally if other podcast player developers add support for the seasonal tag of Apple Podcasts, you will be able to see the seasonal breakdown in other apps as well. For now, it's just a regular feed, so you will see the episodes in chronological order, but if you use podcasts, you will also get the fancy seasonal organization in the app. So I felt like I should mention that because it's an important difference.
Yeah, that's worth mentioning. All right, Federico. Well, we should get to talking about writing because that's what this entire season is all about. And so we thought we would share a little bit about our backgrounds and some of our thoughts on both, I guess, the creative side of writing, but also some of the commercial sides of writing. Everything that we do kind of day to day at Mac Stories. What do you think?
Yeah, that sounds fun. I think I've shared my backstory before, but it should be. I want to go a little more in depth about the writing process itself.
Okay, that sounds good. I mean, we should point people to the interview I did with you on App Stories for the 10th anniversary of MacStories.net because you talked a lot there about how you got started in writing, and that's a really good episode if you want to jump over and listen to that too. I mean, me personally, I have been writing at Mac Stories since 2015. I was a writer for a long time, I guess, in the sense that I was a lawyer for a long time. A very different kind of writing.
You were writing contracts.
I was, and you've seen me do a little bit of that since, but for the most part, I don't do that anymore. And it was an interesting transition because it's so different. I mean, anyone who's ever looked at like the terms of service on a website or something knows that lawyers have a way of writing very long sentences with all kinds of qualifiers that are very hard to understand. And it's not what you would call plain English by any stretch of the imagination. And I don't know. I mean, I didn't find it too hard for the most part to translate those skills into writing at Mac Stories. But once in a while, I'll find myself using some kind of slightly arcane terminology or wordy terminology or overly structured writing, and I do have to fight it a little bit. But for the most part, it wasn't that hard. I mean, it's funny, when I was a lawyer, I actually was criticized a couple of times for not writing enough like a lawyer, that I simplified things a little too much, which I couldn't stand, because I think that lawyers, feel like they have to write that way because, well, they're smarter than the people who hired them, and that's why you're paying them money, is to write complicated things that sound important, when, really the value is in explaining something in plain English that someone can understand, so they can make a decision, not in confusing people and then telling them what to do.
So the writing in a simpler way to communicate a concept better is frowned upon by lawyers?
Not by all lawyers, but I did run into it occasionally. I think there are two places that type of writing comes from. One is inexperience and not being confident in what the result's going to be, so you tag a lot of qualifiers onto things.
Okay.
So that's one thing. Two, there's whole bodies of case law that interpret different kinds of, especially when you're talking about things like contracts, interpret how those contracts are supposed to be understood, and therefore that becomes kind of like magic incantations, like little magic spells that lawyers make, that they have to put those words in there because some case said what they meant at some point in the past. That's another reason. And then I think, the cynical view, I guess, though, is that it's a way to keep people out, because if you make it confusing enough, yes, people have to hire lawyers. It keeps out competing lawyers, but also keeps people hiring lawyers. But yeah, it's a little confusing sometimes. But I've got that's behind me now, and I'm writing more clearly and concisely, I hope, these days.
Mm-hmm. Well, my story is much less exciting. I think I didn't transition from a previous job where I was writing as a lawyer, and I've seen John write. Well, I think it is exciting, especially when you don't want to get John upset, because you're gonna get an email from Lawyer John, and Lawyer John can write in a very I don't know, threatening way, like the way
I know how to get people's attention if I have to.
Yes, the way that you use adverbs and qualifiers, and it's a yeah, you don't want to get John upset. I've seen that, and it is exciting in a way. But my background, well, I guess there is no background really. I started blogging because my girlfriend realized that I was wasting too much time writing long comments on the internet, on forum boards on the internet. And so she urged me to channel my willingness to write into something a little more productive, and not as a throwaway, as a discussion board.
Right, something that might actually support you and pay your bills, right?
Yeah, but I was wasting hours and hours, and maybe in hindsight, it's not so much wasting as it is an investment for the future and networking. But I was wasting hours talking to, engaging in conversations about Apple in Italian, not in English, with other people on the internet, on the forum board of Games Radar. Now I think it's called Games Village. If it still exists, I'm not sure. It was an Italian video game website with a forum board, and the forums had multiple sections, including one for Apple users. And so I was writing and commenting on Apple news and rumors, and I had just gotten my first MacBook, which was my first Mac, actually. Okay. And I was super eager to become a part of the Apple community, and to share thoughts and whatnot. And I started following all of these different blogs, like Daring Fireball and 2av, which was still a thing at the time. Apple Insider, Mac Rumors, 9to5Mac did not exist yet, I think. And eventually, like my girlfriend noticed that I was just literally like 4 to 5 hours a day just talking to people on the forum boards. And so I talked about this in the interview episode. I launched a free WordPress.com blog for Mac stories. did that for a couple of months, and then I decided to actually have my own domain name at macstories.net. And initially, for the first 6 months, maybe to a year, I ran it in two languages. So each post would be written in both English and Italian, and there was a little button in the article that allowed you to switch between languages. But then when I realized that the Italian audience was so small and so capricious, really, the Italians, they don't like this type of, well, most Italians, some actually do. But the public at large in Italy, I don't think the Italian audience is still ready for the type of like more in-depth and considered, type of Apple coverage that you may see on Mac Stories or Daring Fireball. They're more into, rumors and jailbreak walkthroughs, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But some actually do. We do have an Italian audience. But anyway, I switched to English, and that was how I got started. And my English was terrible, and I hope that it's gotten better over time. But I was basically, just trying and see what would happen with no formal journalistic education or background in online writing.
This episode of Dialogue is brought to you by Luna Display. Luna Display is the only hardware solution that turns your iPad into a wireless display for your Mac. Finally, you can use your iPad as a super portable second display for your Mac with stunning image quality and virtually zero lag. Luna sets up in seconds and instantly works over your existing Wi-Fi, or you can use a USB cable when you don't have Wi-Fi. Luna also acts as a complete extension of your Mac, with full support for external keyboards, the Apple Pencil, and touch interactions. It literally turns your Mac into a touchable device. Luna Display is available in two versions. There's both mini DisplayPort and USB-C. I have both of them, and I love them. I use the mini DisplayPort model with an old headless Mac Mini that I run as a Plex server from my basement. That way, no matter where I am in the house, I can access the server and make sure everything's running as smoothly as it should be. And with the USB-C one, I have it connected to my brand new Mac Mini that I use at my desk to do most of my work for Mac Stories. And what it allows me to do is get up and away from my desk. The weather's getting better here in Chicago, and I'm going to be working outside this summer for at least a few weeks until it gets cold again. And the Luna Display is going to allow me to do that. So I don't have to, when I think of something I need to do on my Mac, I'm not going to have to run into the house and run down to my basement and sit in front of a desk. I can stay outside and access my Mini straight from my iPad. Luna Display was developed because they knew that there's a better solution than relying on software to turn an iPad into a second display. Unlike software apps, Luna harnesses the raw power of your graphics card, giving you the full benefit of its acceleration, delivering a stunning second monitor that's 100% wire-free. Luna runs on a proprietary liquid technology, which features color-corrected output and retina resolution. So what you see on your iPad is exactly what you're getting on your Mac. All right, I have a special deal just for Dialogue listeners. You can get 10% off a Luna Display if you go to lunadisplay.com and enter the promo code DIALOGUE at checkout. That's DIALOG at checkout. Again, to get 10% off the Luna Display, go to lunadisplay.com and use the promo code DIALOGUE at checkout. I'll put a link in the show notes too. Our thanks to Luna Display for the support of Dialogue. I want to talk to you a little bit about your writing process because, as much as you and I have talked about so many different things over the years, I don't think I have a very good feel for how you get started when you sit down to write one of your stories. And maybe it's different, whether it's a link post versus just a standard review versus something like your iOS 12 review, which is huge. I don't know. What's that process like, Federico?
That's a very good question. I'm going to start from the easy ones. When it's a link post, so when I just want to link to something on Mac Stories, it's usually something that I saved for later. So it's something that is already in my Safari reading list. So when I have the time, maybe if it's something that I want to make sure that it's on the website like today or tomorrow, I also make a reminder for it.
Right.
I go there, I read the article, I choose something to quote, and I have a little shortcut that turns that selection that I want to quote from the original website and creates a new draft in my text editor, which is IA Writer these days, so that it's ready for me to go with the title of the original post that I want to link and the blog quote for that selection. And when I do a link post, I usually there's no previous note taking or research or mind mapping involved. I just do it all in one go.
Okay.
And sometimes link posts they get out of hand and they become bigger articles. And in that case, when I realized, this is taking me longer than I thought, and I want it to be like a bigger story, I set it aside and I start taking some notes. But at that point, I just add notes to the bottom of the post. Like I don't switch back to another application.
Right.
I just continue sketching out my thoughts at the bottom of the draft. I don't use outlines in the sense that I don't use, and now I'm switching to the bigger pieces like my app reviews or personal stories. I don't use an outliner, like a separate outlining app. I either use a note-taking app or I use a mind map. The mind map is usually reserved for the really big stories, like the one that I did about the iPad last week, or I think it was last week, or my iOS reviews. Those necessitate having a mind map, just because just the span of the story. When you're talking about a 50,000 word story, just taking notes is not enough. And for me, the outline does not scale well enough. So in that case, I like to have multiple branches, multiple nodes and sub-nodes, and be able to collapse sections and to sort of visually see the size of each chapter, each section.
Right.
The mind map is useful enough in that context that lets you assess the kind of scope of a chapter just by looking at it. App reviews and stories that are not as big as my iOS reviews or the iPad story that I did, I usually have a note in the note-taking app that I'm using at the moment. And I've recently switched back to Apple Notes because I was very unhappy with Evernote's performance on iOS. But typically, the way that it goes is, if it's an app that I'm testing, because I have a beta before it comes out, during the beta testing process, I already save thoughts and comments on little angles. I always like to have my own angle for how I start a review, or like, what's the main angle gonna be here? And so, for example, with Calzones, which was an app by David Smith that I reviewed last month, I had the angle in mind of, I'm a person who works with time zones, because I have colleagues all around the world. And so that was my angle. And I always try to find a specific angle, like a specific thing that makes the article stand out. With the iPad story, the thing was, the iPad has been in my main computer for 7 years, and it's right before WWDC. This is how I've been using it. And sort of it's a last recap before everything changes again with iOS 13.
Right.
So that was my angle in that case. And I always try to have an angle. For smaller articles, I save notes. And so when I'm starting to write, I either keep the notes on the side, like in split view, and when I'm writing, I take a look at the notes, or I just merge them. Like I literally cut them and paste them into the text editor, because the notes are already structured as an outline of sorts. So it's like there's an intro, there's a middle section, and there's a conclusion.
Right.
And so as I go, I paste the notes at the bottom, and as I go, I delete them, because it means I'm approaching the end. So that's roughly how I approach writing.
That's interesting. I think that the way we approach things is kind of similar. I don't use a separate note-taking app for most of the stuff I write. I usually do what you described, but instead of pasting the notes from a note-taking app to the bottom of the article, I just will open up a new document and give it a, I used to get kind of hung up on giving it a title right away. And it's like, before you've even completely thought through what you're going to say, writing a title is really not a very good idea. So I'll usually just put, header one tag and the name of the app. And that's all and maybe the word review, like, I don't know, Twitterific review or whatever it might be. And then I'll just paste in notes as I play with the app and think about it, and that'll all be there when I get down to starting. And I usually write things very linearly. I don't start in the middle. I really do spend a lot of time sometimes on the introduction, and that, I think that's in part something that I've learned from you, is the whole idea, as you described, of coming up with an angle, something that provides insight on how the app is used and also makes it interesting, and so that it's not like, so it doesn't read like an owner's manual, and that's probably where my lawyer writing sometimes gets me in trouble, is that I do think very structurally and in kind of outlines in a way. So it's very easy for me to run through a series of features on an app in a review. That stuff comes super naturally to me, but really needs to be more than that. So I do spend a lot of time. Even if I write that section, I'll write an introduction, and usually it's not very good first time out. Then I'll just plow through describing the features, which is probably the most structured part of a review like that. But then I'll let it sit if I have the time, and I'll think about it more. And that's usually where I come back and redo the intro so it has that angle. I've by that point I've got something of a conclusion, so I finish up the end of the article. And then I go back and look at the body of it and think about, all right, well, this describes how this thing works, but where in here can I give examples and provide ideas about how either I use it or how I think other people might be able to use it? And one thing I guess I want to ask you about, one of the things that I find hardest to write about, there are a couple articles I find hard to write, but one of the hardest is an app that I think is really good, but it's not for me. And those can be very difficult to write because it's hard. You can't really. You have to kind of put yourself into the shoes of someone else and get comfortable that it's a good app. It's just not something that's going to be something that you use long term. Because I think people come at those kind of articles with a little bit of skepticism as to, well, is it really good if you're not using it? And the answer, I think, is a lot of times yes, but those I find extremely hard to write.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think I have it easy in the sense that personally I tend to write about things that I'm passionate about or apps that I'm using, and I tend to avoid writing about apps that I don't use or that I don't like. In general, I don't write about things just to criticize them or things that I absolutely don't like, because as I mentioned on App Stories, I don't want to waste people's time. And so if I don't like it, then why would I subject you to reading something that I hate? That's not useful. That's not what I want people to get from my writing. But I tend to, I see what the topics and the apps that I choose to cover as I need to find a balance of writing about something that I like and ideally something that I use, but also like in a way, sort of like trying to be a parent in the sense I want to explain why I love this product, but also I want to explain the things where the product falls short, but like in the hope that it will get better in the future. So sort of using my experience in terms of app coverage to sort of drive the development of the product, maybe to the extent where I like this app and I use this app, but here's where you need to get better. So that tends to be my approach. But I think I wanted to mention how the angle, right, the thing that you choose to as a writing device, it can be useful because it gives you the freedom to create a constraint for yourself. And so the moment that you find an angle and that you set clear boundaries, I think, in terms of where do you see this story going. And so I feel like when you find your specific perspective about a topic, in this case it's the software that we write about, um, you are free to choose to avoid other topics, other things, because they don't fit your angle. And that creates an implicit expectation in readers that, for example, the calzones review, again, that was a good example. I did not cover the calzones widget at all. But that was not an issue because I feel like my readers know me and they understand the angle that I was going for. My readers know that I don't use widgets except for the shortcuts widget. And so even though I didn't cover it, nobody asked for it on Twitter. Nobody said, oh, but you didn't cover the widget, because they expected that I would not cover the widget.
Right.
And so finding my angle in iOS reviews, especially when I omit certain topics, when I don't write about them, it's because they don't fit in the context of the angle that I'm going for and the sort of story that I want to tell. And so I think, because as you mentioned, I don't want to write a user manual that has to cover all the topics and all the details. I want to have my own take on something, which also makes for good business, really, because it makes you stand out. It makes you unique. It gives you that thing, right, that people seek on the internet. There's so much choice. Why would you want to go for something that is not diverse enough, that is not unique enough?
Right.
And so I think finding your own take, your own angle, your own perspective in this kind of writing can be also useful, not just from a creative perspective, but also from a financial perspective, because it puts you in a position of saying, my content, my writing is differentiated enough, and you're not going to find this type of angle anywhere else.
Yeah, I think you and I are not probably very far apart on this, in that when I say, for instance, that it can be hard to write about an app that you like, but it's not for you, I've got a good example, which is the original review of Agenda when it was only on the Mac. And I was really excited. You know, it was very, very unique and different app that had still has a very opinionated kind of design and a take on note taking. And I enjoyed it, but I couldn't use it. And I couldn't use it because it wasn't on iOS yet. Now they came out with an iOS version, I think, less than 6 months later, and I've been using it ever since. But that was what made writing that Mac review difficult, because it was clearly a good app, clearly innovative, one that I thought a lot of people would benefit from and would be interested in. But at the end of the day, despite enjoying using it when I was at my Mac, I found the constraint of not having those notes available on iOS too much for it to be kind of my go-to day in and day out note-taking app. So that's the kind of thing I mean, I think. This episode of Dialogue is brought to you by our friends at iTube Downloader. iTube Downloader for the Mac lets you download YouTube videos, channels, or entire playlists with just a few clicks. Downloading your favorite videos from YouTube shouldn't be hard. iTube Downloader makes it incredibly easy with a super clean UI. The app has a built-in dedicated YouTube browser, so you can find the videos in an environment that you're comfortable with and familiar with. The first step is just find the video that you want. The second step is to press that download button. Third, well, there isn't a third step because the app is just that easy. At the same time, though, there's a lot of power under the hood. The app supports subtitles and captions, Mojave's dark mode, 4K video where it's available, and high frame rate videos, so you can see those 60 frame per second videos the way they were intended. You can also set whatever folder you want to send your downloads to and specify whether videos should be copied to your iTunes library. And one of my favorite features is that there are Safari and Chrome extensions, so you can download with iTube Downloader even if you're just browsing in your favorite web browser. On top of that, if all you want is the audio, you can download that as well. What's more, with a single purchase, you get a lifetime of updates, and you can use iTube Downloader on up to 10 different Macs. I've got a special deal to tell Dialogue listeners about. You can get 20% off using the offer code Dialogue2019. Just use that at checkout to get the discount. Again, that's Dialogue2019, DIALOG 2019 at checkout at alphasoftware.co to get 20% off. I'll put a link in the show notes too. Our thanks to iTunes Downloader for the support of the show.
Another type of story that I think is, at least for me, and I think also for you, very difficult to write is the super personal one.
Yes.
Like the one where you talk about more about feelings and, personal experiences, maybe problems that you had in your personal life in the past. And I'm no stranger to this type of story, right? I wrote on Max stories about my battle with cancer a few years ago, and I wrote about music in the context of how music can spark memories from the past and sort of let you associate a specific playlist or album with a specific moment of your life. That story, I Made You a Mixtape, is still one of my all-time favorites personally. But it can be difficult to, and I think for me, what makes this type of story difficult is how to understand where you need to draw a line in the sense of, am I writing this as if I was talking to a shrink? Like, am I just am I just writing this because I want to get something off my chest? Like, is it a diary or is it an article? And that is a very important difference, because if you're writing for yourself, if you're writing a journal, it's not necessarily something that is entertaining. Because what the reality that I feel like needs to be understood is that even when you're writing something personal, somebody else will use that as a piece of entertainment, as something that they can read because they just want to pass the time. And so, coming to this realization of, I'm writing about my experience with cancer, but somebody else will just use this article as something that they can, occupy 30 minutes of their time. And it makes you wonder, boy, this is, I don't know if I should publish this. And so, I don't know. How do you deal with this?
I think it's really hard. And I think it's one of those things where you have to ask yourself, what is it I'm exactly trying to say? And why am I trying to say it, right? I mean, especially the why, because the why answers, is this just something I want to get off my chest, as you said? Or is this because I've experienced something in my life that I think, while may not apply to everyone who reads this, it may be analogous to other things that people have done or are dealing with or whatever it is, and it might be useful to them in that context, something analogous to what they dealt with. But I find that very hard too, because it's, it's very hard to kind of step outside yourself and look at it from that perspective of someone who's coming to this not really knowing you personally, as opposed to, you're writing things down as if you're writing them to one of your closest friends. And that's it's a very hard line to draw sometimes.
Yeah, I think for the kind of online writing that we do, and sort of the type of publication that Mac Stories is, the thing to understand is that whether you like it or not, when we write and when I write these personal stories, I like to think that they will be, and this is why I write them, because my goal is to find a way that my experiences can inspire somebody else, or maybe they can be useful. They can help them deal with, with something that is going on in their lives. But it's very difficult and it's draining. Like, it's emotionally draining to write these stories and to edit them and to make them a piece of entertainment, especially when it's about you and when it's something so personal and so close to your heart and then it just becomes a link that people can visit and read. But also, having said that, this is difficult, it's also the most rewarding, at least for me, type of story that I can publish. It's the these stories that I've done, and I've done a handful of them in 10 years. I've done the first one about using the iPhone for exercise and diet when I was recovering from chemotherapy. And I've done another about music and playlists and the concept of mixtapes when I was a teenager, and mixtapes now. These type of stories are the ones that and Second Life, also from 2018, I should mention, is another that I'm really proud of.
Yep.
They drained me in the sense that I needed to take a break after publishing them for a couple of weeks.
Yeah, they are really exhausting. I'll say though, I agree with you. I do think they are rewarding. Probably the one for me that is the most like that is the one I wrote when I left my job as a lawyer and started working full time with you at Mac Stories. And I wrote that. I almost didn't get written, and it almost didn't get written not so much because I didn't want to write it, but because it came right after the season of OS reviews. So we had just gone through your, I guess it was iOS 11 review, and my High Sierra review, and I was literally exhausted. And kind of the day I published the Mac review, I sat down and I just wrote till like 2 a.m. and got out all the basics, the rough draft. And then I worked on it a little bit longer after that, and a few days later published it. And I was just completely spent by the end of that because it was on top of all that busy season. But it's also the story that when I meet readers out in the real world, that I hear the most about from people who understand a little bit where I'm coming from. And I think as a site too, there are a lot of websites people can read out there about technology. But what's different about Mac Stories is that you have a sense of the people who are actually writing these stories and what's important to them. And I think that creates a better and stronger connection with the people who read the site.
Another aspect of writing that especially applies to online writing, but I think also in the broader context of other forms of writing, it also works. And it's a topic that we're going to revisit, is the idea of controlling your identity and controlling the platform where you're publishing your writing. And in the context of online publishing, this is a topic that always comes up when people ask me, I want to get started with blogging. Should I use Tumblr? Should I use Medium? Should I use WordPress.com? And my advice is, if you're serious about writing and having an online presence and being a writer online, even though it's an investment, but you should own and you should control all the different pieces, all the different elements of online writing, starting from your domain name, starting from the service that you're using to publish, having a website, having your own domain name, having your own identity, and avoiding the allure. And I may sound like an old person, but over the years I've been proven right time and time again about this, but controlling your website, controlling your domain name, controlling the technology that you use to publish your articles. I always recommend against going with closed platforms and proprietary ecosystems where you don't really own the words that you're publishing online. Somebody else owns them. And this is a difficult advice to give because it comes by default with a barrier to entry. And I don't mean to discourage people who want to get started with online writing, but I feel like the investment that you need to make to have a cheap server up and running and a domain name and a free installation of WordPress on your own website, you can probably get it done for less than $50. And
right.
you can use a default theme. You don't need to invest thousands of dollars to get started with online writing, but I feel like it's absolutely necessary, because we live in an age where these big companies don't necessarily care about what happens to your links, what happens to your posts, what happens to your name. And I feel like making a name for yourself, having a presence, having an identity, and being able to always own and control the digital words that you put online, that is something that you will be thankful for in the future.
Yeah, I think that that's right, and it's the kind of thing that needs to be constantly reevaluated because it's something that we think about at Mac Stories whenever we're adopting some new technology or service or whatever it is. I mean, obviously there are dependencies at Mac Stories. There's a server sitting at Mac Stadium, and there's WordPress as the back end, and there's various vendors that we use for things. But in the end, Federico owns the domain, and we have control of all the words and whether they're on the web or not. It's very different in that sense than something like Medium or Tumblr, where you're not. They don't really care as much about what your words are. You're kind of a commodity to them to sell subscriptions around or ads or whatever it happens to be, depending on what closed platform it happens to be. And Federico, actually, I kind of took your advice on this when I approached you originally about writing at Mac Stories, which was I had been thinking about publishing that first article that I wrote about affiliate linking on Medium, and I didn't want to because I knew. I mean, I had that sense of, I did not want that. I wanted that article to have a broader audience than it would ever get on my own website, which was just the website for my app. But I didn't want it on something where if I wanted to write more, I'd be beholden to a big company. And that's why I approached you. Now, I suppose...
Things worked out all right. I guess.
It worked out all right. It worked out in the end. So yeah, I kind of took that advice and did it that way. I mean, I guess you could say I jump started my entry into writing kind of on your coattails. There's no doubt that that's true. It's not MacStories.net isn't JohnVorhees.net, but it's different to me in the sense that you are not a big corporation, a big faceless corporation that doesn't care about the people who you work with. You're Federico Vitici, and I know you, and we're friends, and I share, a lot of the same values as you. And so that makes it very different than using something like a big service.
So before we wrap up the episode, there's one quick topic that I wanted to mention, but also I wanted to say that during the interviews that you will hear in season 1 of Dialogue, we will participate, John and I, during the interviews. We will not just ask questions. We will, as we go through this process and as we learn from our guests what their experience has been like, we will talk about other aspects of writing, because part of doing this is realizing that, and we wanted to have the first season about writing, is because we write for a living, but we do not necessarily know all the intricacies or all the details of other types of writing. So it's been definitely informative being able to talk to writers who write, but in other forms for other types of media. So that will be interesting to follow as we learn through the season. And I look forward to doing the final episode with you, John, at the end of the season and see what we learned during doing all of this.
Yeah, I think that'll be a lot of fun at the end to just kind of wrap things up and look back at everything.
Something that I will that I will talk about during the season, that I will make sure to bring up with all our guests, is the idea of what's our take on the role of and sort of the balance between hard work and luck, or call it fortune, or call it privilege. But the idea that if you're a successful writer, do you owe that to yourself or to the conditions around you that put you in the position to be a successful writer? So how much is it luck? How much is it privilege? How much is it art work? And for me personally, this is something that I struggled maybe in the past to accept and to think about, because I know that I worked hard to build Mac Stories, but I fully realize that the fact that I was born in Italy, I was not rich growing up, but we were not broke, and so that in itself was a form of privilege. And also the fact that I was born in a country that has a national health service, and that when I got sick, I was able to get treatments for free. I did not go broke because the government paid for my treatments. That is also a form of luck and a form of privilege in itself. But also, That is true, but I think at the same time it can also be true, and this is sort of my take going into this at the beginning of the season. I also think it is true that hard work allows you to build a fortune for yourself, allows you to build other conditions around you that would not exist without hard work. You don't become a successful writer just because you're privileged. You need to work hard. And I think that is absolutely true. You cannot be a successful writer or a writer that inspires other people if all you're counting on is luck, or if all that you're counting on is your privilege. And so I think it's having a balance of both is what ultimately needs to and make. I mean, there may be cases of people who absolutely cannot write, but that somehow are successful because they had luck. Right. Maybe those people exist. I don't think they are the people we're gonna interview in season 1 of Dialogue.
No.
But I sort of I wanted to have your take on this, John. What do you think the balance is between these factors?
I think they go hand in hand, because I think it's the hard work that puts you kind of in the path of luck. Because if you're not looking for the opportunities and finding those opportunities, a lot of that comes down to working hard. Then they're just gonna they're gonna pass you by. And I feel very fortunate myself for having been just kind of at the right point in my life when you and I got to know each other. That my kids are older. I had more time to write and have a day job for a while there, for example, and to having worked a long time as a lawyer, just to kind of have the financial fortune and good position to be able to walk away from that and have a bit of a cushion without having to be too terribly stressed about that move. So, yeah, I do think a lot of it has to do with privilege and a lot of it has to do with fortune, but the hard work, I think, is a necessary ingredient as well. And we've got some really good guests who I think will bear that out in a lot of different and interesting ways. And it wouldn't be the first episode if we didn't give people at least an idea who we're going to talk to this season. Don't you think, Federico? Maybe we ought to let the cat out of the bag at this point?
You could say that we have a very daring guest coming up.
we do. We have Mr. John Gruber of daringfireball.net who's going to join us for the next episode. And actually, we'll have 2 episodes with John talking about, all kinds of aspects from the early days at Daring Fireball when he was working extremely hard to make a name for himself. And the writing process, where he sees the media industry going, and a whole lot more.
I looked forward to interviewing John John is one of the writers that inspired my career when I got started. Daring Fireball was already a popular blog, and so being able to talk to John, not just about Daring Fireball, but really his experience with online writing and his approach to making Daring Fireball stand out, and the business of running Daring Fireball, and the future, where he sees things going, and Markdown. It was really a good conversation, and I'm super happy that we get to have John as our first guest on Dialogue. And as you mentioned, it'll be 2 episodes, so with a nice clean break in the middle, sort of 2 different types, 2 different conversations. We had a real long chat with John, so it's I'm very happy with the way that it turned out, and I cannot wait to share here on Dialogue.
Yeah, I'm very excited about it too. And John works in kind of the same sphere as Federico and I do, and once we're finished interviewing him, we're going to take some left and right turns very quickly and yes. Talk to some people you may not have ever heard about, but I think I would suggest will be very valuable to listen to, because I think having those multiple perspectives on writing has been really eye-opening and informative for me and Federico, and we're excited to share those interviews with you as well.
Yeah.
All right, Federico, let's wrap this up. Episode 1 is down. I want to thank our sponsors again, Luna Display and iTube Downloader. You can find me and Federico writing over at macstories.net, like we've been talking about this entire episode. Federico's on Twitter and Instagram as Viticci. That's VITICCI. And I'm at John Voorhees on both. JOHN VOORHWS. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.